Hey everyone, I am Lamel Overton, and today I'm going to discuss how do we look at Q ethically. How do we know we're using Q? I'm sorry, how do we know using Q is an ethical approach to research? So, um, a lot of times when it comes to, at least for me, learning about newer research, I wonder in what ways can it be used in ways that are not harming, in ways that are affirming and healing to whatever the participants they're using, right? And in that goes to my second question: how can we make sure our research is ethical as we engage using Q methodology? I feel like that's really important to always remember and always to keep in mind that um as we recognize the power that we have as researchers, what strategies can we continue to think about, and what ways can we continue to remember the positionality of both us as researchers, or um, researchers and professors, or researchers and leaders, or researchers and teachers, or whatever we have in our intersection as researchers, and the participants that we're researching. Now moving on, right? I want to maybe understand what it means to be ethical, and what do I mean by ethics. When it comes to research, ethics is the guiding principle for conducting responsible research, while still educating and monitoring the science conducting the research to ensure that there's a high ethical standard. When we talk about the ethical standard, we're talking about there are many ethical resources that you can use, or resources that you can refer to when it comes to ethics, such as the American Psychological Association has an ethics resource that researchers can use and can engage in order to make sure they're maintaining the highest ethical standards. But look at this, right? How do we know, like, what is guiding our researchers, and how do we know that they're maintaining um in all forms of what could be considered responsible, right? How are they not being irresponsible with their research, if we can think of it in a way that's kind of like reverse engineering? What does it look like to be irresponsible in research? Um, and that's something I'm going to talk about in another slide. But just simply looking at it like harm, right? And the way I think about the ways a way that you can think about being responsible in research is, in what ways are you healing, working with your participants and making sure that they're benefiting the best way that they can, and or the information that you're gaining uh does not put uh, um your research participants in any positions that are harmful, or that can be socially seen as um harmful. Anything that pushes pseudo hegemonic ideals, anything that begins to work towards a more divisive and um non-inclusive world. I think that we can think of how we just trying to get us an understanding of the way we can look at responsible research. So, there are five principles of ethics that we can look at. So, very just quickly: intellectual property. So, who's doing the research and who are the authors? Um, that's just an agreed upon basic thing. Conscious of the multiple roles that the researcher plays. So, what is the researcher doing? What is the author responsible for? The informed consent rules. So, understanding, having the participants understand the purpose of your research, how long they're going to do it for, what they're getting into, and anything that any kind of risk assessment that can be avoided as they engage in the research that they're engaging with you. Also looking at how how they benefit from the research, how you're going to keep it confidential, and what incentive they have to participate in. And number 4 and number 5 are kind of like very, very simple ones. So just making sure that you're being confidential and private, and making sure you're tapping into all of the ethical resources that are available. Just like I mentioned in the previous slide about the American Psychological Association having an ethics resource that one can use in order to make sure they're maintaining the highest ethical standards. Just a quick note on my deep dive in the way I analyzed it, right? So I wanted to, as personally as a novice researcher, right, figure out the nuances that envelop Q methodology, and what ways are people engaging in Q methodology and reducing harm in that, working towards responsible research and being ethical, right? And I wanted to make sure that I was able to define harm in a way that people understood. So the word harm refers to placing the participant in positions where they may incur any mental, physical, or social stress, right? I What benefit, unless kind of medical research or any research that's following a stress focused research, but we should not be putting our participants in any kind of stressful situation. So, in order to work with this deep dive, and figure out what was ethical in research, and how strategies of ethics are used in certain Q methodologies to avoid harm, I want to look at a few examples of studies which use Q methodology, and just specifically zone in on what ways that they felt they were, or it can be interpreted as them avoiding harm and being ethical. And so, in asking my question and doing this deep dive, let's define Q methodology, right? So Q methodology is a conceptual framework that, instead of procedures, used to systematically study the subjective. Now, I felt like this was necessary to incorporate as we go into looking at these 3 pieces, because one must understand what it means to be subjective. And then for me, I wanted to really understand, can the subjective itself be unethical, right? And with that, what does Q do to lean towards being ethical? So, my first study I looked at was a study about the faculty and administrator attitudes towards competency-based education, and he used Q methodology by Christopher Flowers. Now, he wanted to look at the viewpoints of community college faculties and administrators towards competency-based education and try to figure out why, right? What I felt was things to highlight and moments of ethics and reducing harm was, one, he's looking at the viewpoints. So there isn't this pertinent or hard answer. There's when we hear viewpoints, we know that there's a range of answers. When he created his concourse, he used compounded literature. So not just literature that he might have read from antiquated text, but he also used social media. There were also other forms of literature that he used in order to create the concourse. In addition, he stated that in creating his concourse, he had to reflect on the multiple identities that were engaging in the concourse as well. In reflecting on that multiple identities, different identities may experience harm based on different things. So, as researchers, I take that as a gem and think, okay, if I'm going to, participate or engage in some kind of Q methodology for my own research, I must have literature that is compounded. I must make sure that I understand the intersections that my research participants are in. I must remember to not look for just one individual hard answer or viewpoint, but understand that I'm looking for the range and my participants are familiar with the topic. These are all things that I was able to garner from literally his Q methodology study. I noticed that these were moments that if I were engaging in this, I will feel comfortable because I will understand that these nuances were addressed. Q study number 2. We just have to get on with it. Inclusive teaching in a standard-driven system. So there were 2 goals. What are the primary teachers' positions on the inclusive education agenda? And what are the primary teaching positions on the education standards agenda? I really highlighted the words position because I felt like that was another example of how one was being ethical. They're not looking for hard answers just as the research did in the first one, but understanding the ways that their participants feel about these certain perspectives. In addition, the researcher added semi-structured interviews with the Q source in order to develop the concourse. So little different than the first researcher, this researcher worked alongside with the participants to create the concourse, so that the concourse was in a sense reflective of the participants' ideals. Brown states, I was aware that at various stages of my research, I would need peer debriefing. Prior to conducting my pilot study, I reviewed my factor statements with 2 lecturers. I also reviewed my factors with several lecturers, my faculty, in order to gain different perspectives on interpreting them. That is really important as a researcher. We are working with human beings. Human beings are going to interpret information differently. So what ways are we making sure that the information that we're giving out is neat and is appropriate? The last one I looked at was the mother's value in their grocery store purchasing decisions, a Q methodology study. It was a reflection of decisions made by participants when it comes to grocery store. I understood that as ethical because of the idea that, again, it's not saying, oh, this is what mothers value, but it's saying this is what these mothers value, and this is how we can understand the information as well. There was a reaching out to participants for clarification when the author felt like they need to understand something more based on the answers. The participants' answers. They used surveys. They didn't just have interviews, but there were also post-interview surveys. Post-interview. Okay, I get mixed up. There were post-interviews and then post-interview surveys, both of which were meant to gain more clarification on the information given. I feel like that's important because as researchers, we have a tendency to be experts, quote unquote, and use our expert knowledge to interpret an answer that may not be there or that may not be true, and that our participants whom are in this experience, how they answer it they understand in their own way. So, is Q ethical? Well, based on what I saw on my studies, I do believe that it is ethical. And I believe it's ethical because it focuses on the varying viewpoints. It relies on the help of participants to help interpret data most of the time, not all the time. And it looks to make discoveries rather than to test specified hypothesis. And for kind of like a takeaway for myself, as I remember to maintain the highest forms of ethics, remember what it means to be subjective, and to say that when we're talking about subjective, we're talking about the various perspectives that emerge. Can the subjective itself be ethical? That is my job to balance my Q-SOAR in it, and that's how I can lean into be more ethical. Thank you, and have